I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London for Al Mayadeen television. Coming from London, but talking about the Gulf. You wait for ages for a bus and then three come along at the same time. The same thing seems to be happening with the recognition of Israel by one Arab country after another. First, of course, it was the United Arab Emirates, since joined by Bahrain. And by the time you see this show, who knows who will have joined them. What's it all about is the question we'll be exploring today. I spoke at a meeting in Bahrain maybe 10 years ago now. It was one of the most successful pro-Palestinian gatherings I ever addressed in the Arab world. And by the way, these were governments supporting Bahrainis, but their fervor for the Palestinian cause was considerable indeed. I had a lot to do with the United Arab Emirates in the time of the late and great Sheikh Zayed. Who would have imagined that the land of Sheikh Zayed would lead the way in this wave, at least, of normalization of relations with the State of Israel, which continues to occupy, desecrate, siege, sanction, and regularly kill large numbers of Palestinian people. I don't know, of course, what Sheikh Zayed would have made of it. I have my suspicions, but it wouldn't be seemly, perhaps, for me to explore them. Who will join them? And what does it all mean? After all, these countries are merely satrapies of the United States empire. They are hardly significant players, even in regional politics, never mind international politics. Is this all window dressing for Donald Trump's re-election campaign? Will it last after November and President Trump's victory or defeat? Who knows? I'm joined by an audience of three because of the coronavirus, of course, but they are distinguished experts, and we'll be hearing from them in the course of the next hour almost. Syed Mohsin Abbas, you are a journalist, political analyst, and an activist. Let's start with you. What's your take on normalization with Israel by these Arab Gulf states?
Well, I mean, as you've rightly put it, George, it really is just a coming out of the closet, if you like. The fact is that the relations did exist between Israel and the UAE. There have been military and security arrangements that have been there for quite some time. This is simply formalizing and making it all public.
Announcing the marriage rather than living in sin.
Basically, this is the key. And they were, of course, reluctant to do it over the last few decades because Arab opinion genuinely was very, very pro-Palestine. As you again pointed out, there was a real genuine concern and feeling for Palestine. But I think within the Arab world, there is a stronger element which actually probably wants to just get on with its own life, if you like. They don't want to stick their neck out for Palestinians quite the way they
haven't been sticking their neck out, though. It's not as if these are frontline states that the Palestinian people will miss.
Well, certainly. Jordan, of course, has already made an entente with Israel. Egypt's already done it. The Turks have got relations.
Although they condemned the decisions by Bahrain and the UAE.
Absolutely. So hypocrisy abounds, and there's a lot of hoodwinking that goes on. But the reality now is that we're in a new era, a new game, because Israel, of course, its position and the American position in the Middle East isn't quite as powerful as it used to be. China's emergence and this Belt Road Initiative and the support, the alternative financial support in the region that's emerging for the likes of Iran, Iraq, even Syria and Turkey, is impacting the American, if you like, dominance of that region. And the likes of the UAE and the Jordans of the world, the Kuwaits and the kind of the Bahrainis, of course, they've been with the Americans, but now I think they've got to publicly be shown to be on the side of America.
Although I'd be surprised if Kuwait follows them.
They've certainly not indicated it, and they're saying, no, we're not going to be having anything to do with it. Probably because I think geopolitically, they're probably even more on the front line, very accessible and open. Any war breaks out, Kuwait is just easy meat, really, isn't it? You saw that with Saddam.
Well, that's an interesting point you make. Iran's response, which was typically militant, made the point that the UAE would now be regarded as a belligerent country in any Israeli aggression against Iran. That's quite a serious threat.
It's a huge threat. I mean, of course, the Iranians launched attacks on 2 US military bases after Commander Soleimani was assassinated by American forces. So they're not. They will go through with any threats they make. And Iran is in a position where it feels very, very encircled. The UAE has 3 US bases. Fujairah is its naval base. Americans have more ships, if you like, in UAE ports than any other place in the world. American trade has been very strong. 2 military bases exist in the UAE on the ground as well. So clearly the UAE connection is very important in the region. Those bases could be used by Israel. There may be new bases that Israel might want to set up. And I think the Islamic Republic of Iran, of course, will be looking at this with great interest, shall we say. And I think the UAE is much more likely to be on the front line. And don't forget, UAE has been boxing above its weight as well. Its interests in terms of the civil war in Libya can't be ignored, and up against Turkey, actually. Its dislike of the Islah and Muslim Brotherhood is a significant factor across the Middle East. Their involvement in the Yemen war, maintained through the STC, the South Transition Council, they have a huge influence on southern Yemen, and actually are at loggerheads with even their Saudi partners in that region. Yemen, the UAE has been trying to secure ports across Somalia, Ethiopia, in Yemen, even in the Mediterranean. They seem to see themselves as traders, perhaps, and they want these kind of ports. And the Americans, who have a $14 billion trade surplus with them, are hand in glove with them. And so this is a partnership which is economic as well as military, I think, in that region.
Fatima Helow, you are a Palestinian, a writer, a filmmaker. It's one thing to know that your partner is having an affair. It's another thing to watch it on television, marching proudly down the street, remarrying. How does a Palestinian feel about the sons of Sheikh Zayed flying to Israel and dancing?
Well, the answer for that actually had come yet. We saw the Palestinian united in the Palestinian embassy in Beirut and in Ramallah, when we saw that public meeting between the whole Palestinian parties from right to left, sitting down, talking and negotiating what next should be done for the Palestinians, refusing that Abrahamic agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel for very simple reason. They are not representing the Palestinian official body, which is the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is being substituted from any agreement between Arab. The Arab League is not condemning as well this Abrahamic agreement between the Israeli and the United Arab Emirates. If we need to go back about the agreement between the Palestinian, the PLO, and Israel in Oslo agreement, particularly, it was based in 1993, was based on the giving the land back by peace, according to the United Nations resolutions 338 and 242. Oslo also based on the fulfilling to the right of the Palestinian people of self-determination, which resulting in Israel representing and recognizing the PLO. That this is today is not recognizing by the Arab, actually by the United Arab Emirates or any Arab country is normalizing with the other side, with the Israelis. They are substituting the Palestinians. They're saying that annexation, they are stopping the annexation, which is not right. They are not stopping. Netanyahu said it clearly. He said they will postpone it, not stopping it. So that means they are going to back and do the annexation anytime later. This is the fear. This is the issue about the annexation. They ignore the Palestinians, substitute them, which is not right, because you cannot go and negotiate on behalf of me. You know, you cannot go on behalf of us and do these things. This is not right. We paid this price actually before, during the camps war in Lebanon, and many Arab countries, also other Arab countries, were trying to interfere to take the representative of the Palestinians from their hands, and we fought about it, and we managed to stop this. Now we are seeing other Arab countries, they are trying to do the same thing or the similar thing, which we refused.
What do you make of the statement made by a former head of Mossad that the Arabs are sick of the Palestinians? Does this new development reflect that?
Well, Netanyahu said it actually, that it's not a veto for the Palestinians to stop the Arab going to normalize with Israel. It is up to them. If they are happy with this, it's up to them. But we have our right to decide what we want. They don't have the right to do that. He can say whatever he wants to say.
So for you, it doesn't change anything?
It doesn't change anything. We have the right, what we want, what we need to take decision in the future for our Palestinian future, not them.
Patrick O'Regan, also a journalist, former editor, indeed, of the Newsline, looking at it from a Western or a British perspective, how does it look to you?
Well, I think that those Arab states that have now recognized Israel are really trying to rescue America and Israel from a very critical situation. I think that the Arab League refused to actually condemn the UAE for recognizing
The Arabs have a league?
They have a league, but it's watching and waiting to see what would be an offer for it. So I think what's happening here is that Kirchner came to Palestine with a deal of the century. They created Jerusalem as the capital of the new Israel. They tried to buy Palestine, but they wouldn't sell it. And this, I think, created a huge crisis in the Israeli government. The Israeli government is a government of extreme crisis. It's led by a corrupt criminal. Half of the state is trying to get rid of him. There are mass demonstrations outside his house every night of the week. The whole Israel is in a desperate state. It's weak, it's divided, and what do? They come to its aid. The Arab states that recognize Israel are actually propping it up. So the Israelis are now able to say, we'll forget about annexation for the moment, but we'll come back to it later. In other words, what's happening here is that the Palestinian people are being completely betrayed. The Arab states are seeing what they can get from the United States, and they're willing to sell Palestine in order for deals with Israel, in order to get the latest American machines, these American jet fighters that UAE wants.
F-35,
That's right. Israel is queasy about them getting it, but they'll have their way, because they're keen to settle the Palestinian question at the expense of the Palestinians in order to confront Iran. I think this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to build up an anti-Iran front. I think the vast mass of the Arab peoples will be extremely angry. I think they have every right to be angry. They have every right to take to the streets to bring down those collaborationist regimes who are selling the Palestinians out and selling their own people out. And it's a huge situation that's developing. There is a massive crisis. You know, what's worried Israel is that Syria is back again. And Syria last week advanced its claim to the Golan Heights. And, you know, the Syrian Assad, the Syrian regime, the Syrian government has survived the storm. And they are now fighting with the support of Iran and the support of Hezbollah. And
Russia, don't forget Russia.
yes, yeah. They have the naval bases and the air bases. So it's an enormous situation. And I think that I don't think the Arab people will accept it. I think they will rise up. I think if you look at Beirut, there you have had two massive explosions. There's people are being treated like junk. The French are trying to get back Macron and all the rest of it, and the people there have had enough of it. I think what's required in that country is a workers' government. It's been looted by the bankers who've looted the country, who've completely smashed it. And what's required is a workers' government that will expropriate the banks and bring in socialism. And I think that this is a tremendous situation. I don't think the Palestinian people will accept being treated like dogs. I think the Arab people will rise up against the rulers that want to be the lapse paw of Israel and the United States. And I think this thing has only just begun. And it's a completely different situation. Why? Because the major imperialist powers are in a huge crisis. If you look at Britain, at the end of November, you could have 9 million unemployed. The Tory government now says, what do we do? They can't print money forever. You're going to have millions and millions of very discontented people and very discontented workers in Britain. In the United States, you've got Trump, who says that if he loses the election, it'll be because it's a fraud, because of the postal vote, and he won't accept it. And in many ways, that would be the best outcome, because if he tries to hang on against the will of the people, there will certainly be a general strike, and they'll be swept away. So it's not the old days where imperialism was all powerful. Like the British line is now a tailless, whatever you want, rabbit or something. You know, it's incapable really of any kind of action. And if you look at, you've got a situation here now in NATO, where the Turks say they're defending NATO, and they're prepared to go to war with the Greeks and the French, who are after the oil in the Mediterranean. So there are tremendous divisions. The capitalist world isn't as strong and powerful as it was. So the Arab people have got every right to rise up in places like the Lebanon and insist that there's a workers' government that the bankers have got rid of. The bankers have looted the Lebanon. They've done it over the years. The latest two explosions is only just the most chronic expression of that. People have had enough of it. People have had enough in Palestine of being betrayed. The Palestinian people have fought heroically. Nobody can fault them. They have never flinched whatever's been thrown at them. And they've stood fast. They deserve
better.
Exactly.
Let's hear a Scottish voice other than mine. Mick Napier from Edinburgh, who is the chair of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Mick, how have we got to the stage where an Arab country like the United Arab Emirates is, I was going to say starting a relationship, but making public a relationship with Israel?
Look, I think anyone who's surprised has not been paying attention, because Israel and the UAE and the Saudis have been very clearly cooperating under the table for quite a long time. I mean, one dramatic example of this, and I give it to show how close the relationship has been, is a guy called Abraham Golan heads an operation called Spear, which are mercenaries. He's an Israeli based in the USA, and he boasts to US media that he has been on contract to the UAE to carry out an assassination program in the Yemen against members of Al-Islah party who are opposed to the UAE policy there. So that's just one example of how close the relationship has been. So it comes as no surprise, shocking but not surprising. And it comes against a background of the US has withdrawn missile batteries and soldiers from Saudi. And it's this long-term decline of the US interest in the region, which has led to the UAE thinking that the permanent door into Washington is through Tel Aviv and wanting to get closer to Israel for that reason. There are several other reasons, trade, money, etc. But I think those are the strategic impulses towards this open acknowledgement of what has long been a fairly intimate relationship. I mean, when the Israelis sent a murder squad to kill a Palestinian resistance leader in a Dubai hotel room, the UAE made, I mean, information was sent to Interpol, arrests were supposed to be made, but I don't think the culprits in Israel have anything to fear, because it was always for appearances and not based on reality.
Is this relationship with Israel sustainable in the long term?
Well, there has been, I mean, what do you mean by long term? There has been a joint Egyptian-Israeli siege of Gaza since Hamas won the elections. The cold peace between the two regimes has endured since 1979. It's bitterly unpopular among the great majority of Egyptians. By the way, there was a very strange event recently, something very odd. It was an opinion poll conducted in Saudi Arabia, actually across the Arab world, which showed the great majority of Arabs, when asked, more than 80%, getting up to 90%, saw the Palestine issue as an Arab issue, something that concerned them. And that indicates the strength of feeling. We saw it sometimes in the streets of Algiers recently, when there were huge demonstrations, and those demonstrations were peppered with Palestinian flags. And the regime that was the target of the demonstrations tried to boost its pro-Palestine credentials at the same time. So I think it's unsustainable in the long term, but for the Palestinians, God knows what long term means. I mean, they're suffering terrible crimes in it.
And finally, Mick, why are the mass of the people in Western countries more or less completely ignorant of the current situation between Israel and Palestine?
Well, the sad case now is that with the defeat of Corbyn, at the highest echelons of British politics, the option of backing a force which is pro-Palestine, which is critical of Zionism, has disappeared off the agenda for the moment. But public opinion in the UK is not so very different from across the EU and most of the world, and it's very hostile to Israel. I mean, let me remind you that I think it was as long ago as 2004 or 5, the EU conducted an opinion poll on the issue of which countries were a danger to world peace. Israel came top in every country in the EU, and Franco Frattini, the EU Foreign Affairs spokesman, apologized to Israel for the opinions of Europeans. And he promised Israel that this public opinion would not influence EU policy towards Israel. Now, that's not in the past and buried. Every opinion poll since then confirmed that Israel is held in deep suspicion and contempt by populations, regardless of public discourse. So it's the same situation, well, it's the same basic relations as I've alluded to in the Arab world, of not as intense, of course, but a hostile population and a regime that's collaborating.
Much more of this after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kalima Horra. We are discussing the rash, as it may be by the time you see this program, of recognition of Israel and normalization of relations between Arab states in the Gulf with Tel Aviv, or is it Jerusalem? And do they care anyway about the difference? Syed Mohsin, the big enchilada is Saudi Arabia. It's the shoe that hasn't yet dropped. Are Saudi Arabia also on this track? There are reports that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was due to secretly meet with Israeli leaders in Washington, and then Trump would release that picture after the event. In the end, he didn't go, mainly because of the Khashoggi affair, the Washington Post columnist who was chopped to pieces by Saudi hitmen. But Saudi Arabia has rejected the moves by the UAE and Bahrain. Do you think they're going to follow suit?
It's quite likely. I mean, the only thing that we picked up on the radar is that Sudais, one of the prominent scholars, the Wahhabi scholars in Saudi Arabia, has started making public noises about Jewish Arab fraternity and quoting the Quran about how, you know, we must be all really good Jewish folk. Well, we all know that. We're kind of all for that. The issue is whether we need to be good with Zionist sort of fascist inclinations. That's where we need the edicts. But he's certainly weighed in beginning to create a soft power, religious, if you like, narrative for the Saudi government to perhaps latch onto. But I don't think it takes away from the reality of the Middle East. The reality of the Middle East is that there is a resistance axis. Like it or not, there is a combination of the Syrians, large sections of the Iraqi, if you like, population and military forces, you know, the Hashd al-Shahabi. There is Iran. There is the Palestinian link. I mean, Hamas, Hania has been directly meeting Hezbollah, meeting Syed Nasrallah. And they've declared openly that there is a solid partnership and collaboration. Israel was bombing Palestine to smithereens for days upon days over the last kind of certainly this month, incessantly. Literally after the UAE declared its intention, Israel went to town. So you can see that it emboldened Israel to sort of make a point as well by bombing those, if you like, forces which they consider to be a real threat to them there. And that threat, of course it is real, because the Islamic Republic of Iran has made no bones about the fact that they are totally behind the Islamic Jihad in Palestine. They're behind Hamas. They're going to be behind Hezbollah. And that is a situation which Israel has brought upon itself because it's constantly invaded, constantly trying to push this Yinon plan that they've had on their minds for decades. And many would argue that the fact that Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia are all in the pockets of America. Actually, it means they're in the pockets of Israel, and therefore Israel already has implemented bulk of its Yinon plan expansion of a greater Israel without doing it formally. It's kind of a colonialism of sorts, but it's done in a very subtle form, and it's imperialism, but it's, again, not quite as obvious. Now these guys, these puppet regimes are coming out. It's becoming clearer to the ordinary public that they have a choice to make. Either they have some self-respect, either they want independence, they want sovereignty, they want to move towards a sort of a democratic future in which they're empowered, not ruled by dictators, not dictated to by America or Israel's policy sort of decisions in the region, or they acquiesce and they become subjugated puppets like these particular leaders who, let's face it, they were the ones who were put in place as the British colonialism transferred power to American imperialism, or Zio-American imperialism, some would say. So they've kind of now got to the stage where they want to declare that openly and publicly, but the battle is going to happen. There is a war coming. I mean, I think it's almost unavoidable because the intransigence of sort of the Israeli, if you like, electorates constantly voting in these kind of effectively fascists, as far as I'm concerned, these Zionists who are in power, are not after compromise, they are not after equality, they're not after really bringing together Israel, the entity they call Israel, in some sort of fair and balanced future. It's very much about them, it's about their power and their control. As long as you do that, the people are just going to get even more riled up. And the fact now that the Arab Emirates and the Bahrainis and others are beginning to openly put their weight in the Israeli camp means that the ordinary folk can no longer be, anybody, if they were fooled, can no longer be fooled. And when they make that choice, it's clear either they're fighting for their own dignity and their honor and their kind of, their own ownership of their destinies and futures, or they're saying, fine, we are slaves, we are enslaved people, we're fine with this kind of imperial colonialism, whatever it is. That's a choice which I think the Arabs now, it's very stark, it's very open. And the resistance axis is giving them the alternative of freedom.
That's undoubtedly true, Fatima. But there has been, if you like, sorry to say it, a sectarian reason why many of the Arab masses have not opted for the axis of resistance. And now we have a situation where regimes that were always telling us how religiously steadfast they were and how others were heretics, these regimes are now falling into bed with Israel.
With Israel, it's true. Well,
Where do the masses go in that?
to be honest, actually, what's happening with the Arab, particularly what's happened with the United Arab Emirates, it's not a deal based on international law. It's based in shareholders and business coming together with the Israelis. It's not based on any international law. And this is the difference. This is the issue. If you want to negotiate or if you want to go for any agreement, the Palestinians been fighting since 1965, and then they sat down with the Israelis, but according to international laws. The difference between what happened then and what's happening now is completely different because it is not based on any international law actually to follow. They are recognizing Israel, which is, you know, the occupier of the country, or the occupier of Palestine. You cannot actually
Occupier of Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Of the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Exactly. The critical situation with the Palestinians about the annex resistance. We had this experience before 1982 in Lebanon. The Palestinians, they were in Lebanon, they fighting from Lebanon, from Jordan as well. Before in 1970s, they were attacked in Jordan, they were attacked in Lebanon, and they were told to leave in 1982. Yasser Arafat, Allah yarhamu, he was told, he was asked to leave Beirut because they called it a Fatah land. A Fatah land, which is the party of Palestinian, the biggest party of Palestinians, Fatah land. They didn't want him to stay there because it's not his country. And he left and he said, I'm going to Palestine. And he went. So the issue, what happened is the Palestinians are aware of this. They don't want, and there is there is a decision in the PLO not to interfere in any internal Arab countries' issues because of this, because of what's happening. The resistance, if you want to take an example about Hezbollah in Lebanon, if they are resisting against the Israeli, they are Lebanese. You cannot tell them, go out Lebanon, you are not allowed to fight from Lebanon. They are Lebanese. So you cannot tell them, go out. This is not the case for the Palestinians. The Palestinians are living in Lebanon and Syria as refugees in Arab scattered country and in the diaspora. They're saying, we want our right of return to Palestine. And that's where we are now at the moment. Some parties, they say, no, we can still resist, but the resistance is going to be inside Palestine. And that was the aim of Yasser Arafat when he did the Oslo Agreement. Oslo Agreement is a disaster, but the only thing, you can agree or disagree with this, the only thing that happened with Oslo Agreement, we managed to allocate the problem or the issue of Palestine from outside into inside Palestine. That's all. Many people, they are saying the resistance could be civilian in Palestine, which is what's happening now in the West Bank. It could be annex resilience, like, you know, what's happening now with the Hamas, Jihad Islam, and all of these things in Gaza. It could be, but not. It's not going to be outside Palestine, particularly Lebanon, I would say.
Let's hear from Mark Sloboda in Russia. He's an American living in Russia. He's a security analyst and a senior lecturer in international relations. Mark, what do you think has happened to change this policy that's taking place now in the Arab world?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on your say. What has happened with this, it's not really a peace deal because the UAE and Israel, of course, were never at war. But it is a substantial international relations development. It is not a geopolitical earthquake, as some commentators like Thomas Friedman have suggested in the pages of the New York Times, but neither is it an irrelevant damp squib, because the UAE and Israel have been carrying on a covert, not so covert relationship for much of the last 2 decades. This includes not only intelligence and defense coordination, but it has included a very substantial shadow business dealings back and forth that have been quite profitable to both sides. But with this deal, this is basically taking, particularly not only the political side, but the economic, the business side, which is far more important for the UAE's view of these negotiations, what they are getting out of it.
You've spoken about the economic benefits that the UAE might obtain from this deal, but the United Arab Emirates is already one of the richest countries on the earth. What can they possibly stand to gain financially, economically?
Yeah. So one of the things that Israel is kind of a regional power for is IT and cyber technology. And of course, there has been a covert trade for a long period, but that is expected to increase. And further, opening diplomatic relations with Israel really increases the potential for economic deals for the UAE in the defense sector. And we've already seen that from the United States. The United States has restricted the sale of smart weapons to Arab countries through agreements with Israel in order to maintain Israel's military advantage with such weapons over its Arab neighbors. With this normalization and the formalization of peace, the U.S. is now free to sell advanced weapons, such as smart weapons, but others shortly to follow. And it has already started penning and inking these deals. And it will help increase the UAE's military power precisely as it's starting to flex regional and military muscle in Libya against Turkey, and potentially in other areas. It's basically withdrawn from the Yemenis conflict at this point. But the UAE is not done exerting itself as a regional power.
Will these developments make the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain more secure or less secure?
I don't think that the UAE was really in a national security tight situation to begin with. I don't think that this substantially increases the UAE's national security, but it certainly doesn't detract for it either. But what it does do is further solidifies the UAE within the U.S. Israeli Saudi geopolitical camp in the Middle East. Whereas before it had flirted occasionally, having at worst neutral relations with Iran, but this puts them firmly in this camp. And I don't believe that that substantially increases UAE's vulnerability to Iran, but it of course does extend the threat, the umbrella of U.S. military protection over the UAE. But because they weren't actually in a situation where they had any real threat to their national security, I don't see that as substantially increasing their protection. This is more about, for the UAE, about diplomatic relations and economic relations.
And finally, what impact will these deals between Arab Gulf countries and the state of Israel have on what we, I suppose, only just still call a peace process?
As part of a peace process between Israel and Palestine, I think has unfortunately been essentially extinct for decades. already. This certainly doesn't advance it, but it is another nail in its coffin, because this breaks the tradition that Gulf Arab nations will not normalize diplomatic and economic relations with Israel until a peace settlement with a recognition of a two-state solution and a Palestinian state. That is now off the board completely. It already was de facto, but this is now public. And we will continue to see what remains of Palestine continually eroded away with ethnic cleansing. And I believe that the annexation will still likely happen. And if Donald Trump is reelected, it may happen within his next administration even. So that is not permanently off the table either.
Patrick O'Regan, you are by nature and by politics an optimist. I've known you a very long time. And though you've talked up the crisis that Israel is in, and of course you're right, there are demonstrations, the Prime Minister may be on the brink of the jailhouse, but that will only make way for a Prime Minister who's not really any different, except in style, maybe, to Netanyahu. I think our Russian analyst is correct. This is a major gain for Israel. And if other Arab countries join, it strengthens their position quite considerably. He talked about it as a nail in the coffin. I wouldn't go that far, but it could be seen in terms of international relations to be a very big nail in the Palestinian coffin.
Right. Well, I think that I'm optimistic about the situation, because the major imperialist powers are in such a desperate crisis. Like the United States of America has just been buddying up with the Taliban, and they've gone out of their way to make an agreement with the Taliban after negotiations, which will certainly mean that the Taliban will shortly be ruling Afghanistan. They're getting out. They're not going in, they're getting out. And I think that in the United States itself, they've got a lot of problems and difficulties which they're going to have to concentrate on at home. You know, when you get the president saying that he might not accept the result of the election, well, that's
a crisis, yeah.
That's a coup. And American workers won't have that. They've got no, they're not great supporters of Biden. They don't want Trump, and if Trump says he's staying no matter what, the balloon is going to go up. You'll have a general strike. You'll have all kinds of forces emerging, and so on. Now you look at Britain. You know, they attacked Corbyn as some kind of maniac because he had a spending programme of, I think it was 500 million or something. They've just spent 20 billion. They've got a debt now of 20 trillion. You know, come November the 1st, 9 million workers who've had their wages paid for them are going to be told, as BA has told its workers, either sign up for a wage-cutting new contract or you're out. So there's going to be a tremendous conflict.
So your point is that the big imperialist powers will be very weak.
That's right.
But that doesn't make the United States and Israel paper tigers, does it?
No, obviously not, no. But then if you look at what's happened I remember when Gaddafi met Blair and said to Blair, well, if you don't get rid of me, if you get rid of me, you will have hell will erupt, so to speak, not just in migrants and all the rest of it. Well, what's happened? They got rid of him. That was NATO's war. The French and the British bombed Libya. The British SAS took part in the taking of Tripoli. The French bombed Gaddafi's convoy, and he was butchered by Islamists. Sarkozy and Cameron met at the Benghazi, and they made a speech which was more or less onto Syria. And you've got a spectacular situation where hundreds and hundreds of young children from Britain, whose origins were in one way or another Arabic, were allowed to go out and fight Assad.
And come back here and kill our children.
Right, yeah. But they thought they were going to do it. They thought it was in the bag, that they could remove Assad, grab the oil wealth and do whatever they liked, and so on and so forth. But they came unstuck. They came unstuck. Now, in this situation, any kind of... the Palestinians are not, obviously, they're very, very courageous people. They're not going to allow, after, when Israel thinks time's up, to have their land taken away from them and to be turned into refugees again. They're going to fight. In Hezbollah and these movements are movements that have spent their lives fighting. In Beirut, working people are not going, it's 3 explosions, they're not going to stand for another one. You know, there's going to be revolutionary eruptions. And I think this is going to happen all over the Middle East and all over the world. So I think that, Israel is very serious and so on and so forth, and the Americans are serious. But the Americans are going to want other people to do their fighting for them there.
Syed Mohsin, on that point, it's true, isn't it, that the already existing dichotomy between the countries of the arc of resistance are now fully separate from the other Arab countries, which doesn't mean that the Arab population in the collaboration countries necessarily agrees with that. I actually agree with Mick Napier. Probably 80% of Arabs in even Saudi Arabia are wholly against capitulation to America and Israel. But for the moment, they can't do anything about that. They can't overthrow their regimes.
But I believe they will. I believe they will move towards that. I believe they will be pushed.
Well, tell me what you think.
That's my opinion.
Are the Saudi people, the Emirati people, there's not many of them, most people in the United Arab Emirates are foreigners. Most people in all these Gulf countries are foreigners with no rights and so on. Let's deal with Patrick's point first. Are the Arab masses in the capitulation countries going to stand for it? What can they do?
Well, there are about 30 or 40,000 political prisoners in Saudi prisons. So the fact is there is an opposition, and the Saudis are very ruthless about putting it down. These are religious leaders, many of them from the school of thought which the Saudis actually say they belong to, the Salafists certainly. And I think that there is a strong, if you like, fear of Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. Certainly the Saudis are totally against it, and the UAE have exercised a massive campaign against the Muslim Brotherhood generally. That is an interesting area, because I think it's that Sunni fraternity, which are religious, which at the moment have an infrastructure. They do have a religious mobilization. The Brotherhood has been put down in most of these countries pretty ruthlessly, Egypt, of course, and UAE itself. So they're keeping a bottle on a lot of that organized, if you like, resistance internally. But then there's also just ordinary rank and file folk. As you say, I think most of those people are politically, they're just scared. In the UAE, I mean, you're monitored. The fact is that the Americans have had huge surveillance industry thrown within all of these territories. They watch everything. Nobody can really move.
They'll be watched even more effectively now that Israel's security apparatus has moved in.
Well, there's no doubt about that, and they're going to have a lot of extra video footage. They'll have to hire a lot of folk to be watching all these guys. But the truth is that there is, if you like, a kind of a despotic big brother control of these nations. However, if you push people to the point where actually they really are just completely at a stage where they feel no dignity. And on top of that, I think the other ingredient is if they feel materially pinched. This is what's probably saving the Saudis and the UAE. Only thing that saves them is that they're awash with money. They can keep, if you like, the lowest common denominator in terms of the breadbasket for ordinary folk up at a pretty high level. So people aren't kind of
well, in the
suffering.
UAE, but not necessarily in Saudi Arabia. There's real economic problems in Saudi Arabia.
There certainly is. I think they've started borrowing for the first time in their history not so long ago, and they are not internally as united as people would think. Of course, bin Salman has come in and trampled all over the erstwhile Saudi monarchy's unity. He put, I don't know how many of them, in one 7-star hotel. It was virtually a prison. And then he milked all of the money that he could from
He
them.
hanged them upside down and collected the money that fell out of their pockets.
Essentially, they were sort of they had nice gold taps probably on the bathrooms and all that, but they were certainly being emptied. Whatever
Gold
they had.
shackles.
Certainly. And I think that is something which exists. There is a kind of a mood against this kind of despotic bin Salman style dictatorship, which I think could well blow up in the face of the Saudis. Of course, the oppositions are going to invest in this kind of weakness. The Iranians or any of the resistance axis, if they get half a chance, they will be nurturing anybody who's ready for any such insurrection. For instance, the Qatif, the Shia in eastern Saudi Arabia, were put down absolutely ruthlessly by bin Salman not so long ago. Sheikh Nimr was executed. So there are these kind of resistance groups that exist. It would require, I think, funding and organisation, and that's the issue: is who would do that. And the Muslim Brotherhood or the resistance axis are the only ones, I think, that could actually probably spark that kind of resistance. Whether that happens remains to be seen.
Or the American.
We'll be discussing this one, I'm sure, until we're old and grey. Some of us are already. Thank you very much for watching. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television.